I'm so pleased now to be joined by Bob Harig, golf writer at SI.com and the author of a new book that I can't wait to get into. Hey, Bob, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. I appreciate you having me.
Well, let's start with the book, which is detailing the rivalry that we've all loved for so long between Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson. Tell us a little bit about it, the genesis of it, and why people should find it.
Yeah, well, the genesis behind it really started with just Tiger a few years ago when he won the Masters, his 15th major. I sort of saw that as the culmination of a great career. And wouldn't it be kind of nice to dive into that a little bit? And then I got to thinking about Phil and how the two of them had really sort of, been side by side for the better part of 2 decades. And in fact, Phil was Tiger before Tiger. Most of us are aware that Tiger was a prodigy, a great player when he was a kid, very well known early on TV. But Phil was sort of that without the same attention. He was an incredible player as a junior coming up in San Diego. He was recruited to colleges when he was a freshman in high school. He won a tour event as an amateur when he was a junior at Arizona State. He won on the PGA Tour. Tiger never even came close to doing that. I mean, Phil's amateur record in many ways was just as impressive as Tiger's. And then to think that Tiger came on the scene and surpassed him and blew him away, and yet Phil's record is still the best of anybody else's not named Tiger. So they had their moments between each other too. They weren't necessarily buddies. They were Ryder Cup partners one year, and it was a disaster. I kind of highlight that. They were rivals in the sense that they were competing for the same thing, and they weren't necessarily friendly. Then they sort of got friendly towards the end, and now here we are where we are in golf today, where they're on completely different opposite sides of the debate in the game right now.
It's fascinating where they find themselves at this point in time. How would you categorize their relationship now outside of just how polarizing this has been between Live Golf and Tiger's take on it? I mean, have they found a way to be friendly with one another, like Arnie and Jack, kind of having that reverence and respect for one another? How's their relationship evolved?
I think that's what we would have expected was sort of an Arnie and Jack relationship. As they got older, they embraced each other more, but I don't really sense that right now. I mean, I would be surprised if they've even communicated in the last 18 months to 2 years. They've only been together at the majors a few times. I wonder if they even said hello. They weren't in the same part of the draw. They weren't playing together. They don't really hardly even mention each other. I mean, Phil does a little bit more. You saw recently when Tiger was added to the PGA Tour Policy Board, Phil actually went on social media and commended that and thought it was great for the tour that Tiger was getting involved in that way. Tiger doesn't usually mention Phil by name. He clearly is not a fan of Liv, but I don't necessarily think Tiger is against some of the things that Phil has fought for. He just maybe wouldn't have gone about it in the same manner.
So the one who is maybe preventing that sort of reverence for one another, that relationship, you think it's more coming from Tiger Woods' side, just with him being so vehemently opposed to Liv, or maybe just not extending himself in a way that many people might have expected?
Yeah, I mean, I think even going way back, it was more on Tiger. I think Phil was more, his personality was more outgoing. He was more willing to engage and embrace, and Tiger wasn't. When Tiger was at the top of his game, he kept all of his challengers at arm's length. His friends in the game were a lot older. People that he didn't view as threats. He didn't want to let the guys he was trying to beat get too close. And so it's not necessarily just Phil. It was like that with a lot of players. Tiger was kind of a loner out here. He went about it, by himself. Now that changed as he got older, but it's the younger guys that he has embraced and become friendly with, and they all look up to him, and they all sort of revere him. And when they were in high school, they were idolizing him. And so the younger players like a Justin Thomas or Rory McIlroy, Those are sort of his friends in tour golf, and it's kind of interesting to see how that's all developed because his friends used to be way older than him, and now they're way younger than him.
You know, it's a really fascinating insight that I had never really thought about before. I mean, we saw the documentary and we've known so much about Tiger Woods' mentality, but the notion that his contemporaries would be kept so much at a distance that he wouldn't allow himself to get to know them and vice versa is really interesting context for it all. We all remember when he burst onto the scene as a phenom who was so different. I mean, is that why you think Phil Mickelson's origin story doesn't necessarily get the credit that it deserved just because Tiger Woods was something that nobody had ever seen before?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little puzzling sometimes why Phil didn't get quite the same. Now, listen, before Tiger came on, there was a 4.5 to 5 year difference in age. You know, Phil was pretty popular and pretty highly regarded. I mean, when he turned pro, which was 1992, he had already won on tour. You know, he had won 3 NCAA titles at Arizona State. He had won a U.S. Amateur. He came out with really solid high credentials. But then he got off to kind of a slow start as a pro. Like, he didn't win prolifically early on. He had 9 wins before Tiger turned pro, but it took him a little while. I mean, Tiger ripped off victories right away. 2 of his first 7 starts as a pro. He won the Masters in his first start as a pro in a major championship. You know, he caught Phil at 10 or 12 victories very quickly and blew by him, and nobody even thought anything of it. And I think in a way that sort of hurt Phil in terms of people giving him his due for just how good he was. 45 tour wins, 36 of them in the Tiger era is amazing. There's nobody in the game today who's active other than Tiger and Phil who have 36 wins. In fact, nobody even has 30.
It's such an interesting topic, especially for people that love the sport. The book is called Tiger and Phil, Golf's Most Fascinating Rivalry. Available everywhere for everybody that's subscribing here on our YouTube channel. Definitely go and pick it up because I mean, for those who love sports and rivalries in general, even outside of the game of golf, to get some insight into this particular rivalry, I think is fascinating. Is there one other thing that you can tell us that's in the book that might be sort of a juicy story about the two, or something particularly revealing that you were even surprised by?
Yeah, there's a couple of little nuggets like that throughout the book. One of them goes all the way back to 2006. Tiger. His dad had just passed away in May of that year, and he had not played competitively for a while. And he was making his comeback at the U.S. Open at Winged Foot. Phil famously blew that U.S. Open. He made a double bogey on the final hole when he led by a shot. A par wins, a bogey means a playoff. Double bogey meant he lost. But a week prior to that, they both showed up at Winged Foot on the weekend to practice, and it just so happened they got there on the same day. It was like on a Saturday morning they were going to go out and play, and they both showed up on the driving range, and they were, you know, maybe 6 or 8 spaces apart, nobody in between them, and they didn't say a word to each other. They didn't acknowledge each other. They didn't say hello. And then there was a Winged Foot member who just decided to go who was going to play that day, who decided to take his bucket of balls and drop it right in between them and hit his shots in between these 2 icons of the game. You know, maybe trying to keep them apart. But you know, afterward, that was one of the times when Tiger took some glee in Phil not winning. You know, back then, Tiger relished Phil not winning. I have another story in there about in 2002 when he finished second to Rich Beem at the PGA Championship. And at this time, Phil had not won a major. Tiger had already won 8, and he won 2 that year. And at the PGA Championship, he birdied the last 4 holes to make it really tough on Rich Beem, who's now he does golf broadcasting for Sky in the UK. But Beem was sort of shaky coming in, and he needed to make a bogey on the last hole to beat Tiger by 1. And that's exactly what he did. He had kind of a nervous little 3-footer to win the tournament, and Tiger was in the scoring area with a guy named Fred Funk. And when Beam made the putt to win, and he did a little jig on the green, Tiger stood up in that scoring area, and Fred Funk recounted him sort of giving a fist pump, like he was happy for him. And Fred was like, Tiger, what are you doing? You know, he just made that putt to win. If he'd have missed, he'd be in a playoff. He goes, that's Rich Beam 1, Phil Mickelson 0. And he just walked out. So, I mean, you know, there was animosity back then, you know, and it was sometimes maybe a little bit petty. I don't think it's anything harmful. It's mostly harmless. It's just kind of interesting how, you know, that their careers evolved.
Yeah, that is unreal, and it's so interesting to hear you detail the breadth of just how intense that rivalry was. Because I think even if average golf fans thought, well, they probably didn't like each other that much. I mean, to get the details of it, and also to be tasked, I'm always fascinated by talented writers like yourself who can encapsulate who these people are when they're such nuanced, complex people. I mean, both Tiger and Phil have had dark moments over the course of their careers, personally, professionally. Mm-hmm. How much of a challenge was it for you to get inside their heads, to get their voices, to really have a deep understanding of the hatred, the rivalry that was there at certain times?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly told through others, you know, their caddies, you know, the people who witnessed it up close. You know, you don't get Tiger saying much publicly bad about Phil or actually even good, and vice versa. You know, they kind of had their own way of saying things without saying much, and so you have to sort of, you know, peck around it to find out some of these stories, and you know, some of the little games that were played, and some of the gamesmanship that went on. And you know, I think a lot of this was Tiger's competitiveness. You know, Phil was just as competitive, but didn't feel the need to do it in the same way. He'd rather needle Tiger and do it in a fun way. Tiger was sort of vicious. You know, he was cutthroat, very, you know, blinders on.
Yeah, and it almost suggests to me, this is me just kind of speculating, but it almost suggests an insecurity on the part of the greatest golfer that's ever been, to keep a golfer like Phil at arm's length and to pay so much attention to this mental warfare that's going back and forth. I mean, I know every elite competitive athlete, every golfer has their own sort of approach mentally for how they would navigate the peaks and valleys of their career, but it's interesting to hear how much you detail how much he cares about all of this.
I think it was more Tiger wanting to make sure the other guy felt insecure. You know, I don't know that he felt insecure, but he knew who was good. He knew that Phil was very, very good. I have, you know, one of the big parts in the book was when Tiger came back in 2010 from the big scandal, and his very first tournament, he hadn't played golf for 5 months. He, you know, nobody knew what to expect. He had been through a lot mentally. There was the whole public, you know, humiliation, all kinds of stuff. And he decides to come back at the Masters, of all places. He hadn't played competitive golf since December. There were all kinds of reports that his game was not good. And he ended up tying for 4th, and Phil won that Masters. But going into that last round, Tiger was 3 or 4 behind. He actually had a chance to win, which is amazing in itself. But like his coach, Hank Haney, at the time, you know, recounted how, you know, Tiger knew that he had given away too much to Phil. That as good as Phil was at Augusta, he had won there twice before, as good of a player as he was, he couldn't be spotting him 3 or 4 shots going into the final round. And it's because he knew how good Phil was. So part of this was Tiger's own respect for these guys and their games. You know, he was sort of the same way with other guys at the top that back then, Ernie Els, Vijay Singh, and Retief Goosen. Those were guys that, you know, were sort of the ones trying to knock him off, and they did a few times. And he just was not going to embrace them until a later point in time when, you know, things mellowed a little bit.
It's fascinating. I could talk to you about it all day. I just want to mention the title once again, Tiger and Phil, Golf's Most Fascinating Rivalry. Let's move on a little bit, if we can, Bob, and just kind of go over some big picture headlines. I mean, I know you mentioned just live golf versus the PGA Tour and the crisis that the tour has found itself in over this last calendar year or so, this unprecedented merger, everything that's happened with health scare from Jay Monahan. I mean, there's been a lot going on. How would you describe or classify where the game is now heading into these FedEx Cup playoffs?
Well, it's been a very disruptive and divisive time this past year. Uh, you've got some of the biggest names in the game that left the PGA Tour to go play for LIV, and they were signing exorbitant guaranteed contracts. And we've had major winners of the last several years: Bryson DeChambeau and Cam Smith, who won the Open last year at St. Andrews, and Brooks Koepka, who won a major this year, PGA Championship, and Phil Mickelson obviously became the oldest major champion at age 50 of just a couple of years ago. A lot of these names, they're still stars, and now they decide to go play for this other endeavor and not play on the PGA Tour. And it was going to be disruptive, and it was going to cause some issues. And there was rules being broken on the PGA Tour side, and threats and bans and suspensions, and this enveloped over with the DP World Tour, the European Tour as well. And now what's happened is they've tried to make peace, and we're in the middle of this period where the two sides, the Tour and the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, which backs LIV Golf, are trying to figure out a way forward together. The problem for the Tour is they were so negative towards the PIF during that whole year, and used the political aspect of that against them, that now they've admitted they look hypocritical. They've come back to the table to as instead of fighting them, they're embracing them. Where that goes, nobody is sure at this time, because nobody quite understands how it might work. Does LIV Golf get incorporated into this somehow? Does it get reduced? Does it get blown away? Is it gone? Nobody was really sure. The Tour obviously felt some financial stress because of LIV. You can't compete with that kind of money.
Oh yeah, and staring down the barrel of what I can only imagine to be an incredible expense to try to continue to fight them, especially with the way they came out swinging. Like you mentioned, their PR plan of attack, just completely going after them, and then realizing that it is truly a bottomless pit of money. I think that the PGA Tour was between a rock and a hard place in terms of its survival. I mean, that's just me kind of speculating, reading what I've read about it. And like you said, there are so many question marks now about how this works, what happens, and that set against a backdrop of this rivalry that you detailed in your book, I think is even more fascinating, that Phil and Tiger find themselves staunchly opposed on this one issue, because the LIV guys, have seemingly come out on top. I imagine the golfers, the Rorys, the Tigers, and the rest of the PGA Tour is absolutely frustrated by everything that's happened. Break down the 2024 schedule for us that was released, because it detailed a series of quote-unquote signature events, and I'm wondering if that is any kind of insight into what we could be dealing with moving forward.
Well, the signature events were basically born out of LIV. I mean, I think if you want to boil it down, they came about because of LIV. They are a way to combat LIV. And Tiger and Rory were very much behind it. It was basically a year ago this time. There was a meeting in Delaware at the BMW Championship that Tiger flew up to go to. He wasn't playing at the time, and that Rory was a big part of, and where they kind of hashed out some ideas and decided, hey, you need to take care of the stars a little bit better. And so they came up with this plan that was sort of used this year as a trial run in 2023. They called it a transition year. Now it's been refined for next year. There's 8 of these signature events. They're all limited fields. That's very much like LIV. LIV has only 48 players. These events will have no more than 80. It means there's no cut in 5 of the 8. That means everybody gets paid. Everybody gets paid at LIV. On the PGA Tour, most weeks there's a 36-hole cut, and if you miss the cut, you go home and you get nothing, and you paid all that money to go. So this has sort of been the backdrop of the whole, I guess, narrative, that the separation. There was a group out there several years ago that came to agents and players in the Stars and said, you guys deserve to be compensated more. You're the stars. You drive the sport. Why are you playing for free? Why are you not getting paid if you have a bad week? You know, I had it put to me, you know, by an agent. He had a great point. He said, you know, George Clooney doesn't make a movie without knowing that he's going to get paid for it. He doesn't wait till the end to see how it does. He's a star. He deserves to be compensated. Yet Tiger Woods could show up at a golf tournament and sell all the tickets and all the hospitality, and if he doesn't shoot the scores, he goes home with zero. And so that was sort of an inherent flaw in the golf model, at least in terms of our culture today with rewarding the stars. And so LIV went to the extreme. You know, they went with these huge upfront contracts that, you know, are frankly, they're not commercially viable, but that they could afford. The tour decided to fight back in some way with these designated events. So we're going to have, you know, next year there will be, I believe it's 9 events that will have $20 million purses. A 10th, the Players Championship, will be $25 million, and the other signature event will be 15. Most tour purses are in the $8 to $9 million range, so that's significantly more. And when you consider that there's small fields and there's no cuts at most of them, guys are going to be making a lot of money if they play in all. That was sort of the plan.
Yeah, I was going to say, certainly, sorry to cut you up, certainly something that will appease some of the names that didn't cross, you know, over to go to LIV,
Right.
who are probably really frustrated that they're now on the path towards some kind of long-term merger and they weren't able to collect in that way. You mentioned the PGA Tour Policy Board a couple of minutes ago. What is the significance of Tiger Woods being named to that board?
Well, I think the biggest significance is he now has a vote. You know, the policy board decides ultimately. Like, they get the input of the players, but they ultimately make the decisions. And there had been, before, it had been a little bit weighted. There's 6 independent directors, and there had been 5 player directors. In theory, they all try to come to, you know, the same conclusion. They're not usually telling us if it's a close vote. They're usually telling us everything is unanimous. But, you know, behind closed doors, there might have been disagreement. Now you have a 6th player director. It evens that up 6-6. And it's Tiger Woods, who, let's be honest, his voice matters. And most of the players out here really respect his opinion. Not everybody's going to agree with him every single time, but for the most part, they're going to take what he says as important. And as I've written, you know, does Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the governor of the PIF, want to be on Tiger's side, or does he want to be against Tiger? It's tough to be against Tiger. It's tough to go against him, you know. And Tiger, at this point in his career, where he's not playing as much, we don't even know when he's going to come back again. For him to decide to do this is significant. You know, he's got plenty of other things he could be doing. He doesn't need to, you know, put his angst or his time into this, but he decided he wanted to. He clearly wants to fight for the PGA Tour, but yet I'm not convinced that he doesn't believe in a few things that they're doing that he might feel that are worthwhile. And so it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this goes. Does he totally dismiss LIV? Does he want to see some parts of it incorporated? You know, where does that go? And it'll be very interesting to get his thoughts whenever we get a chance to ask him.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I imagine he views himself as a steward of the game at this point in his career without being inside his head. I mean, from what you've gathered, working in the sport and covering him, could you see a scenario where he does not come back to play golf, or we don't see him at another major, or do you think he needs that sort of swan song send-off?
Yeah, I think it would be nice if he got that swan song send-off. You know, it's easy to say this, but if it weren't for him having a very damaged right leg, foot, ankle, Tiger would still be competitive. He's about to turn 48. He's still that good. I mean, his swing is still good. I mean, I've written it. We've all talked about it. If you could just put Tiger at the ball, he can hit the shots. You know, but obviously getting to the ball is a big deal. And doing that over 18 holes, 5 hours out there, and you do it for 4 days, it's just proven to be very, very difficult for him. He had a surgery a few weeks after the Masters that was meant to stabilize his ankle. Now, What that means can be good or bad. He's probably going to lose some mobility, but he's going to have some stabilization, and maybe that will be good. But is it going to allow him to walk properly or be able to prepare properly? We really don't know. I'd be surprised if Tiger doesn't try it again. I think he likes it too much. I would think maybe we have a chance to see him later this year. He hosts a big tournament, a charity event in the Bahamas that brings together a lot of top players. And then, as we get into next year, he hosts a big tournament on the PGA Tour, the Genesis Invitational. He played there this year and made the cut, and then made the cut at the Masters before he withdrew. Is there any improvement? Is he able to get better physically? Because his game, give him some time, and I would think that'll be just fine. It's the walking part that obviously the part we take for granted in golf is showing how important that is to be able to compete.
Yeah, and it's tough to watch as somebody who admires the sport and loves, watching a legend sort of go on, to see him sort of break down in between the holes just because he can't really walk anymore, or is struggling so much physically. I'll get you out of here because I've kept you for too long already, but I do kind of want to just get your thoughts on the FedEx Cup playoffs. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Justin Thomas did not make the playoff. Is that right? I mean, is that the biggest surprise in your opinion, or what were some of the big surprises for you?
Yeah, that's a big one. Now, they changed the format this year. For the first time, this is the 17th year of the FedEx Cup playoffs. It used to be 125 players made it to the first event, and then they cut it down from there. They cut it from 125 to 70 to 30. That had been the format the last several years. This year they decided to cut it down to 70, and then next week there'll only be 50 in Chicago at the BMW Championship, and then 30 at the Tour Championship. I mean, cutting it down to 70 put a lot of guys in peril. And Justin Thomas has not had a great year. He's been in FedEx Cup playoffs like 8 straight years. He won it in 2017. He's the type of guy that we view as a top 10 player in the world. We wouldn't even think that he wouldn't make it to Atlanta for the Tour Championship. And yet there he was, like, really struggling to get in, and it came down to one shot. If he would have shot one better over 4 rounds last week, he'd be here in Memphis this week. But he's not, because he didn't do that. And it's really the culmination of a poor year by his standards. He missed the cut in three major championships. He missed the cut the week before the Greensboro tournament in Minneapolis. It's just sort of uncharacteristic for him. And so to have him not be in it is a huge shock. He finished 71st, only 70 make it. Adam Scott, another big name in golf, was 72nd. He didn't make it.
Does Thomas still deserve a Ryder Cup captain's pick, in your opinion?
Yeah, boy, that's to be a great debate. I mean, I could argue for or against. I can argue against because his form hasn't been good this year, but yet the Ryder Cup is a different animal than stroke play golf. It's match play. He's a very, very competitive player. He's very good in match play. He was, he's been very good in the team format. He's played in a bunch of them. He's got experience. The U.S. hasn't won a Ryder Cup in Europe in 30 years. Before Justin Thomas was born, or maybe when he was a baby, but yet he played in France. The U.S. got drubbed in France in 2018, but Justin Thomas went 4-1 that week. He was really good. He understands how tough it is. I think there's something intrinsic about that, about having him on there. He's also been a really good partner with Jordan Spieth. They've had a good record together. So there are good reasons to pick him. And when people bring up lack of form, well, after 2 weeks from now, the Ryder Cup isn't really for another month, 3 or 4 weeks. A lot of guys could be out of form. You don't know. They're not going to be playing as much. So I think form is a little bit overrated. I mean, obviously you're not going to not have a guy like Scottie Scheffler on there who's had a great year. Wyndham Clark won the U.S. Open. He's going to be on that team. Patrick Cantlay's had a strong year. Xander Schauffele. Those guys are going to be there regardless. But Zach Johnson, the captain, he's got a tough decision to make. Do you not pick him because he hasn't had a good year, or do you go by his past history and recognize that he's been a pretty good teammate and really good at match play?
I'll get you out of here with this, Bob. There was some news that came out that Jay Monahan is potentially working on a pathway back for some of these live golfers to reapply for the tour if they did want to come back to the PGA Tour? And I know you and I have discussed just how complicated and nuanced all this is in terms of what the future even looks like. But what is the consensus from golf writers or those in your world about the whether or not that would be fair, to sort of allow some of the live guys back in the fold?
Yeah, it's a tough question because, the ones who were PGA Tour members did break tour rules. When you play in a conflicting event, you need, in essence, a release or permission. The tour has their media rights, and when you go play somewhere else, you're hurting your TV partners and your sponsors. That's why you have to get permission. And typically they grant it a couple of times, but not as many times as would be necessary to play and live. So they broke the rules. Now whether or not those rules are legal is another story, but those are the rules. So the tour sort of feels like they have to enforce some sort of penalties to have them come back. But yet, if you're going to be partners again, if you're going to be in agreement and have this alliance, how do you penalize these guys? Do you not want Brooks Koepka to play in the Players' Championship? That's one of the reasons they want to make this thing work, is you want all these guys back together again. Right now, we have too many times where we don't get to see Bryson DeChambeau play in the same tournament as Jordan Spieth. Now that's what we liked before that we don't have now. So how do you bridge that? How do you walk that fine line? And that's going to be tough because do you want to create more animosity and trying to ask them to come back? By the same token, the guys on the PGA Tour who didn't take the big money are like, well, what about us? We stayed loyal and now you're just going to let them back? I mean, it's a really tough thing they've got going. I think a lot of it will depend on what form does LIV exist in going forward. Because a lot of the LIV guys are content to just do that. They might not want to come back and play the PGA Tour. But what if there isn't a LIV as we know it? They're playing 14 events now this season, and that's what they're planning on next year. Well, what if that's pared back to 6 or 8? Well, then some of those guys are going to want to play on the PGA Tour. Well, how do you make that happen? This is a big. That's why these next several months are going to be really, really big, because trying to get this thing across the line is not going to be easy.
Golf is at a crossroads. I know you're going to be following it all. I want to remind everybody that's watching us to just subscribe to the Sportsnaut YouTube channel. And Bob, before I let you go, just tell everybody where they can find the book.
Yeah, listen, I think the best place is probably on Amazon. It's listed on Amazon. If you just put my name or Tiger and Phil, you'll see that book come up. And I'm working on another one about Tiger that's coming out next year, right before the Masters, about his legacy. So you might see that on there too, although it's not done yet. There's a cover, but not enough pages yet. So, but the Tiger and Phil book is still there, and I could probably write about 6 or 8 more chapters to add to it after all that's going on here lately.
I was going to say, and I think there's a couple of chapters maybe still to be written with what Tiger Woods' legacy will ultimately be after all of this. Bob Harig of SI.com, thank you so much for joining me and offering such insight into not only their relationship, but just the current state of golf. It was fascinating. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me.